Hi, I'm Greg Berninger, Ghent Town Historian. In today's trip into Ghent history, since it's February, we're going to be talking about Black history, since February is Black History Month. Now, the reason we have Black History Month is because African Americans have been understudied and under-celebrated and documented throughout American history. And part of that reason is historical racism throughout our nation. But also, it's very hard. Oppressed people are often the least documented people. But if you look carefully, we can certainly find clues to the lives of African Americans throughout settlement, white settlement and black settlement here in Ghent. So the first black people in the Ghent area, before Ghent was Ghent, likely came down the Kleinkill along with their white owners from Kinderhook and up from Claverick as well. So Dutch culture in the Hudson Valley had no problem with slavery. Slavery was a firm part of the fabric of Dutch life almost from day one in the Hudson Valley. Kinderhook especially, Kinderhook had one of the largest slave populations outside of Brooklyn, New York. A number of households in Kinderhook had 10 or more enslaved people. And of course, the top third of Ghent came down from Kinderhook. And as I said, the first settlers into this area probably came down the Kleinkill. And if you look at the old maps, they're all Dutch names. So in 1818, when Ghent is born, slavery is fully entrenched here. In the 1820 census, there were 82 enslaved people in 34 different Ghent households. So in 1820, 3.5% of Ghent's population was owned. A little fewer than 10% of Ghent households had slaves. So 1 out of 10 households had slaves. So I guess you could say it was neither common nor uncommon in the early days of Ghent. Additionally, there were 63 free black people in Ghent in 1820. So that's a total of 145. Percentage-wise, now this is important, about 6% of the population in Ghent for our country's, for Ghent's first census of just Ghent, 6% were African American. So in 1827, slavery ends in New York State. And the 1830 census, there are no enslaved people in Ghent. Now, when I became Ghent Town Historian in 2018, there were 2 facts that people wanted to share with me, and I use the term facts a little loosely. One is that there were elephants in Ghent, and the other that a particularly broad stairs, the stone house at the intersection of Snyder and Route 66, Cemetery Road comes there as well. That Broadstairs was on the Underground Railroad. All right, so I have a rating system for facts that are sort of out there about Ghent history. Number 1, false. 2, possible. 3, probable. And 4, true. It is true that there were elephants in Ghent, as covered in previous videos. And it's true that slaves were owned at Broadstairs. The Hogeboom family owned that entire area, and the Hogebooms were slave owners. More about them later. So it's true that slaves were owned at Broadstairs. It's possible that Broadstairs was on the Underground Railroad because the Hogebooms did evolve into an anti-slavery family. It's probable that escaped slaves from the South did pass through Ghent on the Underground Railroad. And the reason for that is because Ghent had a fairly large Quaker community that had migrated out from Hudson. There was a Quaker meeting house on Harlanville Road. Most of you know the Quaker cemetery is still there. And the Quakers, along with being pacifists, were ardently abolitionists. Now, a lot of people all over anything north of the Mason-Dixon line, if you have an old house, a lot of people want their house to be on the Underground Railroad. I understand that. It's extremely difficult to prove that because it was underground. It was not something that was publicized. It was quiet. It was on the QT because slave catchers would have been around looking for escaped slaves. And a lot of people in their homes, there might be a little space and they say, oh, that's where slaves were hidden. I would suspect more often than not that little space, if there is evidence that it was a living area, was probably a tiny slave quarters, discreet, out of the way, separate from the family, but close enough for the family to keep an eye on the enslaved person. So it's very hard to prove that any house was on the Underground Railroad. The Quakers in Ghent, though, and I tried very hard. I have worked diligently to try to prove that Ghent was on the Underground Railroad, and I've gotten close. That's why it's in the probable category. So the large Quaker community in Ghent, there's some correspondence between people in that community with a Mr. Robinson who lived outside Burlington, Vermont. And Robinson was an ardent abolitionist, organizer of Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves up there, very well documented. And there are actually, I tracked down a few letters in the Middlebury College, which is in northern Vermont as well. Middlebury College has the letters from the Robinson family, and there's correspondence between the Quakers here in Ghent and the Robinsons. And you know, coming through Hudson, again, a Quaker community, out 66 through Massachusetts, north to Canada, it's probable that escaped slaves passed through Ghent. So there was some, you know, between slavery ending in New York and the Civil War, there were some disagreements in Ghent about how ardent someone should be against slavery. And there are some letters in the newspaper, very angry Quaker women in Ghent. They're angry with the Lutheran minister because he would not preach against slavery in his pulpit. And he did not want to be political from his pulpit, because slavery, of course, not only a humanitarian, but like most issues, a political issue as well. So Ghent certainly had its share of ardent abolitionists, people who sat on the fence and probably people who didn't really care. There is evidence the Hogaboom family did evolve into an anti-slavery family. One of the sons of the Hogabooms that owned slaves was a fairly prominent New York State politician, and he was a Democrat, but an anti-slavery Democrat. Remember, Democrats were the pro-slavery party. And in the 1850s, he actually switched to the Republican Party, which was not pro-slavery. Abraham Lincoln, of course, the first Republican president. Okay, so that's 1820 up to the Civil War. By 1920, Ghent's black population stood at 91, which is 3.7%. 3.7%. And I suspect that there was a fairly large population in the village of Chatham, half of which is in Ghent, also documented in an earlier video. Because the railroad was a way for African Americans to get out of the poverty that historical racism and slavery had left them in. Not only Pullman porters, who were almost 100% black, but also working, you know, in groups on the railroad. So Chatham had a pretty large African American population. Now, jumping ahead to 2020, the most recent national census, there are 53 African Americans in Ghent, and that is 0.09%. 0.09%. There are clues through history. Again, you have to look carefully. They don't show up prominently, but they're in the background. There are clues about the inclusion or exclusion of African Americans in Ghent. In 1850, the District 7 School Board voted about where the teachers should live, and one person labeled as colored was allowed to vote there. So I think that's an example of inclusion. Almost all of the early school photos show a mix of kids of both races. The Ghent band was integrated before baseball was. However, the county home was segregated at least up until 1913. One of the brick houses there, one of the brick structures remaining on the county home site, was labeled the Negro House on the early Sanborn insurance maps. So, suffice it to say, the quantity of African American life in Ghent has gone from 6% of the population to less than 1%. However, I think we can safely say, without question, the quality of African American life in Ghent has gone up. From the earliest being the enslaved, who would have come down with their owners down the Kleinkill Creek, to today, when I hope that African Americans in Ghent enjoy all of the rights and privileges that people of all races should and do. So there's an overview of African American history for Black History Month here in the town of Ghent. If there's a topic that you would like me to cover in one of my videos, I have plans for a couple more, or something you'd like to let me know, historian@townofghent.org. So until I see you again, I'll see you in Ghent history.